Everyone, in your supplemental file for today, you have a historical timeline
working within
this
its
concept
landscape
of the
view,
Enlightenment
and I want
to
you to
modern times.
download that now.
And in
and
the
print
last
that
session,
out.
you watched
Because
some
for the
clips
next
from
Camtasia
movie
lecture,
Luther,
I will be using
in which
this
we
particular
saw the
image
Protestant
to draw some
Reformation
connections
beginning to
between
happen.
scholars
But we
and
saw some
history
images
and
of
the
children
PowerPoint notes.
working from different social classes. We also saw the red violin, in which you saw examples of various children and working conditions, and the notion of children being born into particular social classes. And then we also saw Amazing Grace, in which you saw some of the concerns of the Enlightenment era, including such ideas as man's place in the world, who has human rights, who doesn't. In all of those clips, we also saw different enactments of children and their parents, including children with disabilities, including children with talents. So today we're going to continue that conversation from the Enlightenment to modern times, and I'm going to begin talking about some of the key historical places and things on a historical timeline. If you go to your supplemental file, you will find in there a very detailed supplemental image with some beginning places, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, with their debates about the pure man versus order, reasoning, and discipline. One of the key thinkers that has informed some of our work today, and also had much to do with the kindergarten movement, had to do with a Swiss pedagogue and reformer who worked with reform movements and orphan shelters in Switzerland. He wrote a book called How Gertrude Teaches Her Children, and his work was based on the idea of observation, consciousness, and speech, measuring, drawing, writing, numbers, and reckoning. He devoted himself to education, and he bought his own farm where he attempted cultivation. His businesses fared poorly, but he opened his own farmhouses as a school, and that was also met with failure. He wrote around the notion of a good woman and a devoted woman, and during the French invasion of Switzerland in about 1798, there were many orphan children who had been left without food or shelter, and Pestalozzi took some of these children under his charge. He converted his own farm and a deserted convent into a school for them. And he was one of the front runner to really consider the notion of the role of education as to teach children, not subjects. He tended to the children with devotion. And in his later years, he took these ideals and he wrote his famous work, How Gertrude Teaches Her Children. And that came in the 1800s. To begin with, he really looked at the notion of consciousness. And he did not believe in such things as corporal punishment or rote memorization for instruction, but he really believed in the child. So he was credited with some of these training methods and observation. Obviously, he was sympathetic toward children, and his influence still was felt throughout Switzerland and other parts of Europe. He had many pupils, and Friedrich Froebel happened to be one of his pupils. His own wife died in the early 1800s, and around 1815 there was a rebellion among the teachers at his school. So his last years, when he was retiring, he wrote about his adventures of his life and ended some of his writing with a book called Swan Song. And so he himself thought his real work didn't occur later, but really occurred in his early training when he laid the principles of education. And he left examples of his writing in Switzerland and in Berlin. And so for many early reformers who were working with young children, Pestalozzi was an educational leader. So Pestalozzi in this image is shown with the orphans at stands. And this was a painting that was credited to his memory 80 years later. He died in 1815, but this painting was devoted to his sense of welfare and support for young children. So his book, How Gertrude Educates Her Children, was how Gertrude teaches her children, was really about the role of mothers. Some of the images in this next section of these slides have a lot to do with America and the early 20th century. But if you look at the images, you can also see other influences. This is a mother and a daughter, and the book that the mother is holding and in her hand is the Bible. So the date of this is unknown, but it's the earliest 20th century. This is a poster from the early 1900s from America about young children and war. Obviously, these children are left behind after their parents have been killed in war, and The Soldier's Orphan is the name of this poster. So posters like this were really created to draw upon the sympathies of the public to support young children. This is another historical image from popular culture. It's before the 1800s, and it is an image of a mother and a child leaping through a window, and it's called Welcome Home, Papa. So there are sort of some roles of women represented in these images, as well as the roles of what has become the modern family, the mother, the father, and the child, a nuclear family. So in the Enlightenment, we saw children given away to indentured servitude and other kinds of labor efforts, depending on their social class. And as we move out of the Enlightenment into the modern era, the family becomes a nuclear family. This is another image, and this is actually taken from the Midwest. It's a boardwalk. It's more than the baby's first steps, because you can see in the background images of women letting the child have more independence. So this is a city boardwalk with the child looking on. Some of these images are from the State Historical Society in Wisconsin, where I did my doctorate. And as I was teaching some of my first classes, I developed the historical graph that you have in front of you from the supplemental file. This is an image of rural life, whereas this image is a city life of a child and parent, or a child and mother in this particular case. This is another mother and child at work or play in a rural setting with a date unknown. And so you can see very big contrasts between children in the city or children of means and children of education, and mothers whose lives are a bit more leisurely versus mothers whose lives are quite a bit more labor intensive. After Pestalozzi, our forefather from Switzerland, we have Frederick Froebel. And Frederick Froebel is often he's often credited with the founding of the modern day kindergarten. He was born at the end of Pestalozzi's life. He also had quite a preoccupation, just like Pestalozzi did, on the woman's role with children and the special place of women and mothers. He invented the word kindergarten, or the human garden, and he had one of the first kindergartens in the early 1800s, 1837 in Germany. And he was often credited with beginning women's training programs for mothers of young children. he believed, just like Pestalozzi, that innate curiosity drove children's motivations, and his work is often credited for featuring games, play, songs, stories, craft work, and manipulatives with purpose. Froebel was born amongst turbulent times in Prussia, and the French invasion of Prussia allowed a rising German nationalism to happen. Pestalozzi in particular had a mother that died early in his life, and his father sent him to an all-girls school because that education at the all-girls school was more of a quality. Frederick Froebel did early work surveying land, and he also understood botany, nature, forestry, surveying, geometry, and mathematics. He was a student of Pestalozzi's, and he had many of the same beliefs, and he took that notion of women's training further on. He had a belief in God, which he didn't lose, but he also developed his sense of God with diversity and harmony with nature. And his introspection, his preoccupation with forestry and surveying probably had some influence on his beliefs about nature and botany. And one of the things he's credited with is the gifts. He had gifts that he thought children should be given at each age, and each gift that the child was given had some sort of an underlying concept that was represented by the object. So the gifts and occupations, he also had occupations which were things like clay and other kinds of craft work, and those occupations would help the child learn freedom to shape and manipulate materials and tools. Obviously, the gifts represented sort of more of a spiritual element of the child's understanding, and the occupations represented more about the environment and the maybe modern day skills that the child might need to function in society later. So, for example, the gifts that Froebel brought would teach the child to use his or her environment as an educational aid. They also gave the child a sense of the connection between human life and nature. And finally, they were supposed to create a bond between the adult and the child who played with them. So these particular images are of the gifts and preoccupations from Froebel. Froebel is often also credited with a quote, "Give people their bread, and let my aim to be let them give them themselves." So in other words, his educational preoccupation had to help the child find themselves or find what their gifts were in particular. He believed that he was training people in virtue as well as in work success. He trained as many as 260 kindergarten teachers in 1951, and he was accredited with giving training to these kindergarten teachers. And then Froebel's dream was to revolutionize education based on some liberal democratic ideas in Germany. So he traveled all over the country in Germany over the course of time. He was also married. He married a kindergarten teacher, Louise Levine. But then as the Prussian court had uprisings and the revolution in Prussia happened, many of the kindergartens closed. So Froebel's patronage and his tutelage, the people who had been following him, really were not as able to follow him through his training methods. So he felt that these closures of these kindergarten centers really was going to be the demise of his life. In about 1852, he was actually 70 years old. He did get many accolades from the kindergarten teachers who followed him, despite the government hostility. And his influence on Germany had repercussions around the world. So Froebel in some ways was a dangerous man in his time because he was really explaining education as a principle of freedom for people to be able to do things and to understand themselves and to combat oppressive regimes. And at the same time, he felt that that work could be done through the nature of young children or through teaching young children. As we move through the influence of Pestalozzi and Froebel, we also see some of the influences of Rousseau in their philosophies. And if you look at the historical timeline, you can see a direct link between Rousseau, Pestalozzi, and Froebel. In this particular image, we see a young mother and her child. It appears to me that the child is eating with the spoon and the mother is looking on. So this is in the early 1900s, possibly late 1800s. And one of the things that came from Germany and Froebel, Frederick Froebel's work, was a great influence to many American scholars. Whenever Froebel was testing his games and toys for boys, he was probably also developing his gifts and preoccupations, and he really was interested in the interactive nature of children's play. So he believed in this idea of liberation and education for liberty, and the idea of a universal right that children should be able to have an education. As this idea came to America, we had very particular influential thinkers like Elizabeth Parker Peabody. And Elizabeth Parker Peabody was someone who was actually very influenced by Froebel. She was a transcendentalist. In other words, she was someone who was an activist, she was a writer, she was an editor of an abolitionist newsletter. She was very sympathetic to learning, but she was also sympathetic to many kinds of human rights. So Elizabeth Parker Peabody, who was born in 1804, had some of Froebel's teachings when she was in Germany. She was of a wealthy descendant. Her father was actually I think her father was an abolitionist and also a Bostonian. And she was a political figure. Her parents were also quite wealthy. So she was active in the women's suffragette movement. She was also active in library and bookstore work in Boston. She was a publisher when very few women were involved in that business, and she helped people like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Bronson Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. All of those gentlemen who you see listed there were men who profited from Elizabeth Peabody's work as a printer, as a book publisher. Miss Peabody helped Henry David Thoreau write his first work, Civil Disobedience. She also helped Nathaniel Hawthorne and lots of these other intellectuals of the day on the eastern side of our country. So she was also a sister-in-law of Nathaniel Hawthorne, and she was related to the educational reformer Horace Mann. She tended to keep very famous company. Her own identity was fairly significant, but the company she kept was probably more significant. She was very effective in the 20th century movements in terms of changes for religion, abolitionist. She worked with Native American rights. She worked with women's rights. She was, again, one of the first women to really look at the kindergarten movement as a popular movement to help children. So she helped adopt some of the play-centered practices that Froebel brought from Germany. And then she had influence on our nation that children should receive appropriate training because of his or her innate capacity. She also had some influence on accomplishing educational reform for the kindergarten movement in our country. She was very interested in moral reasoning and religious education. She was not particularly distinguished between spiritual teaching and intellectual teaching, but for her, education was not really about facts, but really a lifelong process. So she wrote some of her own books. She wrote the first lessons in grammar on the plan of Pestalozzi, and this was one of the works that allowed teachers in Boston and other parts of the East Coast and Maine to understand some of the kindergarten methods. So she believed, just like Rousseau and Froebel, that children should receive training based on his or her capacity. Miss Peabody had conferences and parties for women, and usually these sessions suggested reading, lecture, and dialogue on particular topics. She was quite well known in her day, and she started her own schools. Some of them were like the Temple School in Boston and places in Pennsylvania. She opened a school for boys in Boston, for example, as well as a school for girls that she was an assistant in. And she believed that proper teaching would elicit the truth in a moral sense within children. So she was very interested in many of the things that women of her day were interested in. But she was a woman of the elite class. Froebel stressed that discipline should be based on not force or fear, but really on the physical exercise of the body. And Peabody liked that. Peabody herself was very avid in forestry, and she enjoyed nature. In her midlife, she traveled to Europe twice to understand Froebel's teachings. And for her, those trips represented a turning point in which she brought back kindergarten ideals to America. She wrote a book or a magazine actually called The Kindergarten Messenger, and she became the first American president of the Froebel Union, which was a group in the U.S. that helped the kindergarten movement in the U.S. So you can see that her idea of education was also to help people, to help children's rights, to help women's rights, to help Native Americans' rights. And shortly after her came another very influential Midwesterner, a woman named Susan Blow. And unlike Elizabeth Parker Peabody, who was educated on the East Coast, Susan Blow was more affluent and also educated well, but she came from the Midwest. So Susan Blow was an affluent Midwesterner. She was born somewhat after Elizabeth Parker Peabody, but she continued the kindergarten movement in the Midwest. She was very interested in Froebel's theories. She opened some of the first public school kindergartens in the St. Louis area. She taught kindergarten children, and then she taught teachers in the afternoon. So she taught both children and teachers. She devoted her life to the education of young children, and she was a very influential figure. She contributed to the spread of the kindergarten movement from the East Coast into the Midwest. She was a lecturer at Teachers College, Columbia. She was very well traveled. She lectured and wrote. She also traveled to Germany, mostly because her father was in the Civil War, and she did get to directly experience some of Froebel's methods. So she did continue Froebel's ideas. She used the gifts and preoccupations, the blocks and other educational materials and handwork activities. And then she also convinced other Americans to continue his work. So about at the time that Susan Blow is important in American education, also the progressive era is starting to form. And that's the new science of child psychology. William Torrey Harris was also a superintendent of schools in St. Louis, and he was one of the gentlemen who also supported Susan Blow and developed more public school methods that we are familiar with today. Susan Blow was pro-union. She was anti-slavery. She had a family legacy of political activism. So she, just like Elizabeth Parker Peabody, was a woman of education, a woman of means. So these two influential figures were part of the Midwest and the challenges that German kindergarten movement brought to America. This is an image from St. Louis, Missouri, in the early 1900s. And if you look very carefully at the image, you could see that there are many children in this photograph, but the children sitting on the ground in the front appear to be children that may have disabilities and developmental delays. As we move into the progressive era, we really start to look at the ways in which the 21st century attention started to be more focused on the social emotional well-being and the individual creativity of children. And that's sort of the hallmark of modern early childhood. So Susan Blow was a very strong advocate for more formal visions of early education. She had a force of character and intellect, and that brought the mainstream early childhood movement into America. Also, simultaneously to Susan Blow and Elizabeth Parker Peabody's work, the 1800s and early 1900s brought the children's labor movement into the full public eye. And the children's labor movement is, perhaps a symptom of the Enlightenment, in which children didn't have a particular special place in society. Depending on the social class of the child would be working just like adults would. So in these two images, you see children doing the work of adults, and you even see a child on the right who's smoking a cigar, just like he or she or he would see his adult contemporaries doing. So you can see in both of these pictures, probably the boys on the left are doing agriculture work. They might be shucking beans or corn. Obviously, young and small fingers were much more nimble, so they had specialized jobs in the workforce, just like adults would. But at the same time, the concerns of children's rights were much stronger because the children were so visible in the labor market during the 1800s and 1900s. In the next slide, you see a shoeshine boy working his little tail off, and you also see a group of very dirty little guys on the right, and they probably were chimney sweeps or coal miners, perhaps. And you can see that the children's health and welfare was probably quite at risk. Children's health and welfare was quite questionable in the 1800s and early 1900s. So in America, you see folks concerned much more about welfare. One of the reformers in the United States who was very important to children's welfare as well as immigrant welfare was Jane Addams. Jane Addams was born after both Susan Blow and Elizabeth Parker Peabody, or she was born simultaneously to them, and she was actually someone credited with the early social work movement. She's quite impressive. Jane was born of a political family. Her father was a governor in Illinois. She was also a feminist. She traveled to parts of Europe as an older woman, but she was educated at the Rockford Female Seminary, and then she was also accredited the next year at the Rockford College for Women. She studied medicine, but she left early because of her own poor health. She traveled for Europe. She spent a lot of time reading and writing and really considering what her own life purpose would be. And at one point in her adulthood, she decided that she was going to open a tenement house for underprivileged families and children in Chicago. So in the late 1800s, she and Elizabeth Burke are pictured in this particular photograph at the University of Chicago, and she also opened Hull House with a woman named Miss Starr, and the Hull House was at the corner of Halsted and Polk Street in Chicago, and this was a center for higher civic engagement and social life. Its institute was to maintain education and philanthropy and to improve conditions of industrialized cities like Chicago. The Hull House was supposed to help families take care of their children, nurse the sick back to health, and to really give supports for different types of troubled people. And in the Hull House and other tenement houses, there were usually kindergarten classes and club meetings for older children and adults. So most of the time, these centers for women and children had civic engagement and philanthropy and midwifery and other types of health concerns at their center. In the St. Louis area and in the Chicago area, you saw more and more kindergartens not just being supported for the middle-class child, but also for the children of immigrants and poor children. So these are a couple of pictures that contrast to the earlier ones we saw that are specifically related to immigrant children. So you see children from various parts of the world, probably Europe and parts of Europe that had experienced political upheaval, etc. Other points about Jane Addams is that she was definitely a very important influence on the Chicago School of Sociology. And if you look on your historical timeline, you'll see some connections between Jane Addams, Hull House, and other key figures in the progressive era, like John Dewey, for example. So if we go back to some of these images of children working in the 1800s and early 1900s, we also can see connections to women working. And so this particular image is a mother breastfeeding her daughter or child while at the same time working in a factory doing labor. And this is a poster from Chicago. And its mission, obviously, is to draw attention to the plight of urban, poor, possibly single mothers who are trying to earn a living and work while at the same time raising children. So you see the dollar sign, motherhood, and the plight of this particular working parent. You can also see in the background, if you look very carefully, you can see some other children in the shadows behind this particular mother who's trying to support her kids. So Jane Addams was someone who was very invested in providing strong experiences for young children and working moms. So she was one of the people who first began working toward finding positive sanitation, positive food, positive other kinds of supports for women, including the vote, which was a national issue of the day. Later, Jane Addams won a Nobel Prize, and she had multiple writings in press at the time of winning the Nobel Prize. She's quite famous. Another psychologist who was a contemporary of Jane Addams was a gentleman named G. Stanley Hall. He was also contemporary of Sigmund Freud, and he's often given credit of being one of the modern-day founders of psychology. He studied psychology and child development at Harvard. He began his career as an English philosopher, but then also studied psychology and pediatrics. He was very interested in adolescent development. He was also interested in Darwin's theory of evolution and recapitulation theories. But he was very much interested in adolescence. The reason that his name is on your historical timeline is because there's a direct connection between psychology and the study of child development and teaching. John Dewey was a predecessor of G. Stanley Hall, and John Dewey also had an influence of psychology on his work, but he was also someone who believed in school as a democratic institution. He was a contemporary of Jane Addams. They both served on boards of directors at the University of Chicago Lab School, for example. And John Dewey is often credited with helping Americans develop our understanding of the progressive movement in the 21st century. So there's a connection between G. Stanley Hall and John Dewey, but there's also a connection between John Dewey and many modern-day early childhood teachers. So John Dewey helped us move from considerations for children in the labor movement more toward democratic ideals for communities overall. And the progressive era is really characterized by a civic engagement for social equity, so Reconstruction, plurality, democracy, voting rights, public thought, education. Progressive fundamentals really have the idea that people should be able to communicate with each other to become citizens. And when John Dewey studied under G. Stanley Hall, he also had opportunities to teach at the University of Michigan and then again at Chicago. He founded the Pragmatic School of Thought at the University of Chicago Lab Schools. He taught at Columbia Teachers College. So while G. Stanley Hall really was studying psychology and adolescent development and thinking about things like racial eugenics and inheritance and behavior, John Dewey was really thinking about functional psychology, how to make psychology more practical on a social level. So he thought about epistemology, which is about the origin of how knowledge becomes truth and how self-action and interaction and transaction happens. He was also very politically active. He was an NAACP member. He was a member of teachers' unions. He worked for cultural revitalization and women's rights. So in some ways, John Dewey is a lot like some of the progressive era women, Jane Addams, Susan Blow, and also Elizabeth Parker Peabody. So you can see some of these progressive era ideas had connections to the Enlightenment in terms of a person's place in society. So the progressive era was really an era of renewed and continuing interest in children. In these images, you can see children in modern-day kindergartens playing circle games. And also, I think on one side, you can actually see the tradition of jack-o'-lantern cutting. What's important to notice in these slides are that all of the people in the kindergarten are women. They could be moms, but they might just be young teachers who are receiving their training. And here also we see some of the modern day ideals of community engagement and civic engagement being carried out with young women who are learning the work of the home, and then young men who are learning the work of craft. You see them working with geometric shapes and other kinds of tools, probably for skills of the trades for men. And then women, of course, you see them working toward modern day skills in the home. On your timeline, you're also going to see a direct link between John Dewey and a woman named Lucy Sprague Mitchell. Lucy Sprague Mitchell was born in the late 1800s, and she moved all the way into the mid-1900s. She was also someone who was interested in progressive philosophy. Thank you, that was my dog. Lucy Sprague Mitchell was concerned with curiosity, instinct, and natural wonder. She wondered about how children learn, as well as what they wanted to learn about. She's often credited with block play because she was interested not just in fine motor skills that children were developing, but the ways they used their whole bodies. She talked about language and experience. She established the Bureau of Childhood Experiments at Bank Street College. She was interested in language, and she was very, very interested in equitable relations between women and the home and the workplace. So you can see in the 1960s, women's roles were starting to move from being solely in the home into the workforce. Lucy Sprague Michael was often credited with changing the American school system. She was very progressive, but she was also radical. She took some of Froebel's ideas, but she changed them also. Lucy Sprague Michael was one of the presidents of our founding kindergarten organization. I think at that time it was actually a kindergarten teachers organization. And Lucy Sprague Michael was the first organizer of the nursery school magazine. And she served as a strong leader at the Bank Street School in New York. So this was the end of our conversation about the Enlightenment and the modern times. And what I want you to do is refer to your historical visual that is part of your supplement file. I'm going to try to pull it up here. And I just want to point out some very important things that we've covered. There are some strong connections in the American education movement to ideas from Rousseau, Pestalozzi versus John Locke. There are also some strong changes from Frederick Froebel to about fostering the child's gifts, to the ways in which Elizabeth Parker Peabody and Susan Blow took up those same preoccupations in America. At the same time, this movement of Rousseau, Pestalozzi, Froebel, Elizabeth Parker Peabody, and Susan Blow was happening in the United States. There was also a very important reformer named Maria Montessori, who was considering the idea of work, order, and self-discipline. She lived into the 1950s, and she was very important. And then at the same time, we have these philosophers and thinkers about young children. We also have the psychology movement that's happening in the U.S. And we have G. Stanley Hall, who was a teacher of John Dewey. We have John Dewey, who was a teacher of Lucy Sprague Mitchell. And then we start into the modern era where we have ideas about progressive teaching, child-centered teaching, letting children be motivated with their own natural curiosity, learning styles, etc., letting the teacher be the organizer and co-designer. The progressive era always has an opposite kind of thought, and that's the conservative era, where the subject matter is more important than the student. So mathematical teaching or literacy teaching has a standard type of instruction, and there's regularity and order. The teacher is the expert, and there's an objective standard of scholarship. So progressive is this idea that the child's nature leads the learning. A conservative teacher or a conservative movement thinks more about the subject matter of the teaching. So I'm going to end there for tonight. And I want to end with just a couple of simple questions that we always end with when we're thinking about young children. And that is the question, what is an appropriate pedagogy for the young child? Or what is the need for the care and supervision of the young child? In other words, what is the custodial and social responsibility for young children for society? Okay? And many of these preoccupations came out through today's lecture, I hope. All right, thank you for listening. This was a long lecture. I hope you could stay with me. When you think about this particular era, the progressive era, think about some of these key figures that we spoke about today.